Hello everyone, this is Refresh, and I'm here to bring you a battle between these two rivals of Ixalan Planeswalker decks. Over here we have Angrath, and over there we have Vraska. We'll begin with the roll of the die to see who goes first. Angrath gets 7. Vraska gets 2. Angrath will have to go first and draw 7 cards. Angrath has a mountain, a swamp, a sure strike, a Cinnabarons, a mountain, and a Stormfleet Pyromancer. There's really not enough action in this hand, so we're going to ship this and go to 6. Sorry, we're going to go to 7 because we're on the London Mulligan rule now. Now we have a Cinnabarons, a Swaggering Corsair, a Direfleet Captain, a Grasping Scoundrel, a Mountains, a Sure Strike, and a Cinnabarons. This is actually quite good, so we will go ahead and get rid of the Sure Strike for the time being. Vraska will draw 7. Vraska has a Vraska's Conquistador, Vraska's Scorn, Plains, Vraska Shimeen Gorgon, Swamp, and Champion of the Dusk. It's a little bit slow, but we do have a early play, so we'll go ahead and keep this. Turn 1, Angrath will play a Cinnabarons tapped, and will pass the turn. Vraska draws. She gets a Vampire Champion. Vraska will play a Swamp, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Repeating Barrage. Angrath will play a Mountain, and then we'll tap both the Cinnabarons and the Mountain to play Direfleet Captain. It says whenever Direfleet Captain attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each other attacking pirate. And then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska draws. She gets a Plains. Vraska will play a Plains, and then Vraska will tap a Swamp and a Plains and play Vraska's Conquistador. It is a 2/1 Vampire Soldier, and it says whenever Vraska's Conquistador attacks or blocks, if you control a Vraska Planeswalker, target opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. And then Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws. He gets a Swab Goblin. Angrath will play a Cinnabarons tapped, and Angrath will then play a Swab Goblin, and then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws. She gets a Swamp. Vraska will play a Swamp. Vraska will attack with the Conquistador. Angrath will block with the Swab Goblin. They'll trade. Swab Goblin dies. The Conquistador dies. And then Vraska will pass turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws. Angrath gets a Swamp. Angrath will play the Swamp. Angrath will attack with the Direfleet Captain for 2 damage. Vraska cannot block, will take 2 damage and go to 18. On his second main phase, Angrath will tap both of these and this, and then play a Swaggering Corsair. It says Raid Swaggering Corsair enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if you attack a creature this turn. That's true, so we'll put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then Angrath will tap the Swamp and play a Grasping Scoundrel. It says Grasping Scoundrel gets +1/+0 as long as it's attacking, and then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska draws. She gets a Vraska's Conquistador. Vraska will play the next Plains, and then Vraska will tap everything and play Vraska's Champion. It is a Death Touch 3/3 for 4 mana. And then Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets Angrath Minotaur Pirate. Angrath will then tap the Mountain, the Swamp, and the Cinnabarons for red and play Repeating Barrage. It does 3 damage to a target creature or player. It will be on the Vraska's Champion. Vraska's Champion dies. Angrath attacks with the Grasping Scoundrel, the Direfleet Captain, and the Swaggering Corsair. The Direfleet Captain gets +1/+1 for each other attacking pirate, so it's +2/+2, becomes a 4/4 for a total of 8 damage. Vraska cannot block, will take 8 and go to 10. Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws. She gets a Moment of Triumph. Vraska will play the Swamp. Vraska will tap out completely and play the Champion of Dusk. It says when Champion of Dusk enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and you lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. We'll draw 1 card for the one that we control and get a Moment of Triumph, and we'll also lose 1 life to go to 9. and then we will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a swamp. Angrath will play the swamp. Angrath will attack with everybody, making the Direfleet Captain a 4/4 again, and attacking for a total of 9 damage. Remembering that Vraska took 8 damage instead of 9 next turn, we'll go ahead and take the extra damage to go back down to 8. Vraska will block the Swaggering Corsair. The Swaggering Corsair dies, and Vraska takes 6 damage to go to 2. On his second main phase, Angrath will tap all of his mana, tapping the Cinderbarons for red, to use the raid ability on the Repeating Barrage. It says, for 3 and red, return Repeating Barrage from the graveyard to your hand. Activate this ability only if you attack with a creature this turn. And then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Skymarch Bloodletter. Vraska will spend 3 mana to play the Skymarch Bloodletter. It says, flying. When Skymarch Bloodletter enters the battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Angrath will lose 1 life, and Vraska will gain 1 life to go to 3. Angrath loses 1 life to go to 19, and then Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Cinderbarons. Angrath will play the Cinderbarons tapped. Angrath will tap the mountain, the Cinderbarons, and the swamp, and play Repeating Barrage on Vraska to deal 3 damage to Vraska. Vraska responds by tapping the plains and playing Moment of Triumph. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life. That will be the Skymarch Bloodletter. It becomes a 4/4, and Vraska will gain 2 life to go up to 5, take 3, and then go back down to 2. Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws. She gets a plains. Vraska will play the plains. Vraska will tap everything and play Vraska Scheming Gorgon. Vraska Scheming Gorgon has 3 abilities. +2, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. -3, destroy target creature. -10 until end of turn. Creatures you control gain Death Touch, and whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, that player loses the game. She comes into the battlefield with 5 loyalty counters. Vraska will -3 immediately to destroy the Direfleet Captain. Direfleet Captain dies, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Swaggering Corsair. Angrath will tap everything and play Angrath Minotaur Pirate. Angrath Minotaur Pirate has 3 abilities. The first one is +2. Angrath Minotaur Pirate deals 1 damage to target opponent and each creature that player controls. -3, return target pirate card from your graveyard to the battlefield. -11, destroy all creature target opponent controls. Angrath Minotaur Pirate deals damage to that player equal to their total power. Angrath will come into the battlefield with 5 loyalty counters, and Angrath will immediately +2 himself to deal 1 damage to Vraska and all of Vraska's creatures. Vraska takes 1 to go to 1, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Gilded Sentinel. Vraska will +2 to go to 4 loyalty and give the Skymarch Bloodletter and the Champion of Dusk +1/+0 until end of turn, making them a 5/4 and a 3/4. Vraska will attack Angrath with the Champion of Dusk and the Skymarch Bloodletter. Angrath will block the Champion of the Dusk with the Grasping Scoundrel. Grasping Scoundrel dies, and Angrath will take 3 damage from Skymarch Bloodletter to go to 4. On her second main phase, Vraska will tap 4 mana and play a Gilded Sentinel, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Fathom Fleet Border. Angrath will +2 to go to 6 loyalty on himself and deal 1 damage to Vraska and 1 damage to each of her creatures. In response, Vraska will tap 1 and play a Moment of Triumph on the Gilded Sentinel, giving it +2/+2 and gaining 2 life, making the Gilded Sentinel 5/5, and will get 2 life to go to 3. She'll then take 1 damage from Angrath and go back down to 2. Angrath will tap 3 mana and play a Swaggering Corsair, and then will tap another 3 mana and play a Fathom Fleet Border. When Fathom Fleet Border enters the battlefield, you lose 2 life unless you control another pirate, which Angrath does, and then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a swamp. Vraska will play the swamp. Vraska will -3 to go to 1 loyalty and destroy the Fathom Fleet border. The Fathom Fleet border dies. Vraska will attack Angrath with everybody for a total of 9 damage. Angrath will block the Champion of Dusk and lose the Swaggering Corsair. And Angrath Minotaur Pirate will take 5 damage and go to 1 loyalty. Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws a card. It is a Daring Buccaneer. Angrath will +2 himself in order to do 1 damage to Vraska and each creature Vraska controls. Vraska takes 1 damage and goes to 1. Angrath will tap a red and 2 blacks in order to play the Daring Buccaneer. And then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws. Vraska will +2 herself to go to 3. Vraska will send Champion of Dusk and the Gilded Sentinel at Angrath, and Vraska will send the Skymarch Bloodletter at Angrath the player. Angrath will choose to lose Angrath the Minotaur Pirate and will take 2 damage from the Bloodletter to go down to 17 life. Vraska will then play both Vraska's Conquistadors, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws. Angrath will attack with the Daring Buccaneer for 2. Vraska blocks with a Vraska's Conquistador. They trade, and Angrath will lose 2 life while Vraska gains 2 life, going up to 3. Angrath will lose the Daring Buccaneer and go down to 15 life. On Angrath's second main phase, Angrath will tap this for red, this for red, this for red, and these 2 for black, and return the Repeating Barrage to his hand, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Queen's Base Soldier. Vraska will +2 herself to go to 5, making all of her creatures +1/+0, and will attack with the Champion of Dusk, the Skymarch Bloodletter, the Vraska's Conquistador, and the Gilded Sentinel for 15 damage. In addition, when Vraska's Conquistador attacks, Vraska will gain 2 life to go up to 5, and Angrath will lose 2 life. Angrath loses 2 life to go to 13, and then takes 15 damage from the creatures assembled and loses the game. So Vraska wins game 1. We'll be right back for game 2 in our best of 3 series. We are back for game 2, and Angrath will choose to be on the play and will draw 7. Angrath has a Mountain, a Swamp, a Grasping Scoundrel, an Angrath's Ambusher, a Dire Fleet Neckbreaker, a Mountain, and a Goblin Trailblazer. This looks like a good hand to keep, so we will. Vraska draws 7. Vraska has a Bright Reprisal, a Queen's Base Soldier, a Swamp, a Famished Paladin, a Vraska Scorn, a Recover, and a Moment of Triumph. 1 land is not a keepable hand, especially with this hand, so we will go ahead and mulligan this to 6. Vraska has a Plains, a Vraska's Conquistador, a Dusk Legion Zealot, a Swamp, a Moment of Triumph, a Moment of Craving, and a Vampire Champion. 2 lands and playables makes this keepable. We'll go ahead and put the Vampire Champion on the bottom of the deck. Angrath will play a Swamp, tap it, and play a Grasping Scoundrel, and then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska draws and gets a Swamp. Vraska will play a Swamp, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Repeating Barrage. Angrath will play a Mountain, and Angrath will attack with a Grasping Scoundrel. It gets +1/+0 as long as it's attacking, so it attacks for 2. Vraska takes 2 and goes to 18. Angrath follows up by playing a Goblin Trailblazer. It's a 2/1 with Menace, and then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska draws and gets a Vampire Champion. Vraska will play a Plains, and Vraska will play a Dusk Legion Zealot. When it enters the battlefield, you will draw a card and lose 1 life. Vraska will draw a Vraska Scorn and will lose 1 life to go to 17, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Headstrong Brute. Angrath will play a Mountain. Angrath will attack with the Goblin Trailblazer for 2. Vraska cannot block, will take 2 and go to 15. Angrath will follow up by tapping everything and playing a Headstrong Brute. Headstrong Brute can't block and it has menace as long as you control another pirate. Angrath controls 2, so there's 2 menace creatures, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Bright Reprisal. Vraska will play a swamp, and Vraska will tap both swamps and play the Vraska's Conquistador. It is a 2/1, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a swamp. Angrath will play the swamp. Oops, should also untap that Goblin Trailblazer. Angrath will tap everything and play the Direfleet Neckbreaker. It says attacking pirates you control get +2/+0. And then Angrath will attack with the Goblin Trailblazer and the Headstrong Brute for 9 damage. Vraska will double block the Headstrong Brute and will take 4 damage, trading her 2 creatures for the Brute and going to 11. The Brute dies, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Legion Lieutenant. Vraska will tap 2 and cast Moment of Craving on the Direfleet Neckbreaker, giving it -2/-2 until end of turn and getting 2 life. That's a 2 life to go up to 13. The Direfleet Neckbreaker dies, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Swaggering Corsair. Angrath attacks with the Grasping Scoundrel and the Goblin Trailblazer for 4 damage. Vraska cannot block, will take 4 damage and go to 9. Angrath will follow up by playing the Swaggering Corsair. When it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter because we attacked this turn, and then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Forsaken Sanctuary. We will play the Sanctuary tapped, and then Vraska will play the Legion Lieutenant, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws. Angrath will tap 2 and a black and play Repeating Barrage, dealing 3 damage to the Legion Lieutenant. Legion Lieutenant dies. Angrath attacks with everybody for 7 damage. Vraska takes 7 and goes to 2. Angrath passes turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Forsaken Sanctuary. Vraska will play the Forsaken Sanctuary tapped. Vraska will tap everything and play the Vampire Champion, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Lightning Strike. Angrath will attack with everybody. Vraska blocks the Swaggering Corsair with the Vampire Champion. They trade. Vraska will take 4 damage from the remaining creatures and perish, bringing the game to 1-1 Vraska and Angrath. We'll be right back with the final game. For game 3, Vraska will be on the play. She'll go ahead and draw 7 cards. Vraska has a Swamp, a Plains, a Dusk Legion Zealot, a Champion of the Dusk, a Swamp, a Bright Reprisal, and a Forsaken Sanctuary. This isn't great, but the Dusk Legion Zealot at 2, and the fact that we have all of our lands is probably worth keeping, so we will. Angrath draws 7. Angrath gets a Swamp, a Swamp, a Swamp, a Stormfleet Pyromancer, a Mountain, a Stormfleet Pyromancer, and a Cinder Barons. This is not a keepable hand. It's way too slow for what we're trying to do. Second hand, Angrath has a Daring Buccaneer, a Swamp, a Sure Strike, an Impale, a Lightning Strike, a Swamp, and a Swab Goblin. We are missing red mana, which makes this hand a bit on the bad side. I don't think we can keep this. We're going to go down to 5. Angrath draws a Fathomfleet Border, a Swamp, a Angrath's Ambusher, a Lightning Strike, a Mountain, a Vanquisher's Banner, and a Stormfleet Pyromancer. This we can keep, so we will. We'll place the Stormfleet Pyromancer on the bottom of the deck, as well as the Vanquisher's Banner. Vraska will begin turn 1 with a Forsaken Sanctuary tapped, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath draws a Swamp. Angrath will play the Swamp. Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps the Forsaken Sanctuary. Vraska draws a Plains, and Vraska will play a Swamp. And she'll tap the Forsaken Sanctuary for white and the Swamp for black, and will play the Dusk Legion Zealot. And when it enters the battlefield, she'll draw a card, and she'll lose 1 life, drawing a Swamp and going to 19. Then Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath will draw and gets a Cinder Barons. Angrath will play the Cinder Barons tapped, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Queen's Bay Soldier. Vraska will play the Swamp, and Vraska will tap both swamps for the Queen Space Soldier. Vraska will attack with the Dusk Legion Zealot for 1. Angrath takes 1 and goes to 19. And Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Cinder Barrens. Angrath will play the Mountain. Angrath will tap all 3 and play Angrath Ambusher. Angrath Ambusher gets +2/+0 as long as you control an Angrath Planeswalker. It is a 2/3 for 3. And then Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws. Vraska will play a Plains. Vraska will tap a Swamp and a Plains and play Vraska's Conquistador. And Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws. Angrath will play the Cinderbaron tap. And Angrath will tap everything else and play the Fathom Fleet Border. Does not lose life because he controls another pirate. And Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws, getting a Vraska Scheming Gorgon. Vraska will play the Plains. Vraska will tap everything and play Champion of the Dusk. She'll get to draw 4 cards and lose 4 life. She draws a Moment of Triumph, a Swamp, a Famished Paladin, and a Vampire Champion, and will lose 4 life to go to 15. And Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Cinder Barrens. Angrath will play the Cinder Barrens tapped, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Famished Paladin. Vraska will play the Swamp. Vraska will then tap everything and play Vraska Scheming Gorgon. She'll come into the battlefield with 5 loyalty counters. She'll immediately -3 to go to 2 and destroy the Fathom Fleet Border. Angrath loses the border. Vraska will then attack with the Champion of Dusk for 4. Angrath will take 4 and go to 15. Vraska will go to the end step. At the end of Vraska's turn, Angrath will tap the Mountain of the Swamp and play Lightning Strike on Vraska Scheming Gorgon to kill her. Vraska has no response, loses the Scheming Gorgon, and ends her turn. Angrath untaps. Angrath draws and gets a Swamp. Angrath will play the Swamp, and Angrath will pass the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Skymarch Bloodletter. Vraska will play the Plains. Vraska will attack with the Champion of Dusk. Angrath will not block, will take 4 and go to 11. Vraska will cast 2 Famished Paladins and a Skymarch Bloodletter. When it enters the battlefield, Vraska will gain a life and Angrath will lose a life. Angrath loses a life and goes to 10, and Vraska will pass the turn. Angrath draws. Angrath will play a Mountain. Angrath will tap 2 Swamps and 2 Mountains and play Impale on the Champion of Dusk, destroying it. Vraska loses the Champion of Dusk, and Angrath passes the turn. Vraska untaps. Vraska draws and gets a Skymarch Bloodletter. Vraska will attack with everybody for 13 damage. Angrath will block the Queen Space Soldier and take 11 damage and perish. So Vraska wins today, going 2-1 against Angrath. Angrath had some pretty bad luck in that last match with a double mulligan and then a massive flooding. Let me know what you thought about the games in the comments below. If I made any rules and or play errors, let me know, and that will help me to play better in the future. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more such videos, hit subscribe. Next time I'll be back with a battle between these 2 decks and the Face the Hydra challenge deck from Theros. Until then, this was Refresh, and thanks for watching.